I am so grateful for the invitation from President Hogg, and one of my life principles is when you get to hang with Dr. Doobie, you say yes, and so it's good to see him here on his home turf, and I look forward to learning from the other speakers and interacting with each of you over the course of the next day or so. The basketball comment I don't remember, I'll confess. It does connect to where I wanted to start. The title that was just read, "The Creator Alone is Fit to Redeem," raises the issue of fitness. And I was going to say that you wouldn't tend to think a seminary professor is the sort of person you ought to expect to hear about fitness from. There are many others we might much more wisely go to. But of course, fitness is language, being fit, that we actually use or assume in lots of areas of life, isn't it? Not just in the realm of physical health or athletic prowess, which some of us long ago may have had, but in so many other areas. You may have heard last year was an election year, and we considered for a range of positions, local, state, national, who might be the various persons fit for various offices, various roles and responsibilities. We assess people's advertising. We listen to the way they present themselves. We have the delightful input of robocallers from all over, and we make our estimations as to who's most fit for an office. But in other areas of life, we consider fitness too. Many of us have had repeated experience of putting in an application for a position, and many of us also have to assess others as they apply for jobs. And much that we could describe going on in that process of reviewing references and taking interviews and exploring someone's work history is really a matter of fit. Are they fit for that particular position? We think of this, of course, in a realm of other areas. We think of someone being a fit romantically. We think of someone being a fit for a position in a local church or congregation. We think of fitness with regard to so many different avenues of life. And it's not surprising then that the language of fitness or fittingness has also been used throughout the Christian tradition. That fitness for this or that task, fitness for this or that role has been a matter of concern. We could think, for instance, in the medieval church, as we'll hear a bit more in later talks. Anselm of Canterbury would explore why it is God became human. As we think about the mystery of the incarnation, why is it that being a fit Redeemer involves being both divine and becoming human? It's really an exploration of the importance of those two terms for the fittingness of salvation coming in this particular form. I want to explore a slightly different question. We oftentimes do think why Jesus has to be God and why Jesus had to be, well, Jesus, a Jewish man born in a particular time, born of the Virgin Mary, living, dying, rising, ascending, and so forth. Someone you might actually track on a map or identify with a GPS locator. He was in a particular place. He was there at a particular time. All of that's important, and I trust you'll explore that in other settings. I want to explore instead why it is that repeatedly Scripture leads us to see the importance of the Redeemer being the very creator of all things. Why the Creator alone is fit to redeem his fallen creation. And I want to begin by looking at the various places in which Scripture does make that connection and draw those two matters together. In 1936, the famous German Old Testament scholar Gerhard von Rad published an essay called "The Theological Problem of the Old Testament Doctrine of Creation." He was not bothered by what you and I might think the problem of the doctrine of creation was. This was not a concern about issues of science and religion. about young earth creationism or old earth creation, the sorts of debates that we often see swirling around today weren't his bother. His concern was rather the fact that looking at the Old Testament, he observed precious few texts that spoke to creation, and he observed that when the Old Testament does refer to creation, it would always be related to, right next to, or adjacent to talk of redemption and salvation. So one example that he would highlight, Psalm 104, which recounts the glories of God in creating all things. God in majestically and mightily fashioning the entire universe. God in his wisdom and wonder fashioning the very details of a given creature or a particular human. God working out creation in his might, power, knowledge, and goodness. And Von Rad would point out, it's not for nothing that follows Psalm 103, and it sets up Psalm 105. That long Psalm 104 on God as the great and mighty maker of all is meant to be heard between two psalms which speak of God's redemption of a particular people, God's favor for his elect, God's love for Israel. And just as much as Psalm 104 gives the widest possible lens view of God's wonders in all creation, it's meant to shape how we look at God's very particular presence. He is the one, after all, who'd identified himself as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Von Rad argues this is paradigmatic. This is elemental and found across the Old Testament. Now, he had particular reasons for making that point. Certain things were happening in the 1930s in Germany, and he was concerned that there were folks who might think that they could look at what's going on in nature or in the world and they could read that as God's work. And Von Rad wanted to warn that God's work in the world is always identified and bound up with what God is doing in redemption, in and through his people, and ultimately in and through Jesus Christ. And so you can't have revelation through nature that is completely alternate to that is even antithetical to that. Now that's an evergreen concern and something we ought not forget, but I want to suggest we're in a world where we also need to think the other way. We need to think not only about how nature ought to be tied to redemption, but redemption is appreciated, is savored when we understand that the one who redeems is the one who first made, and that those who are redeemed as those he first delighted in making. There's something to that connection of grace to earlier nature that is profound and important for understanding not just the gospel, but the God of the gospel and the people that the gospel transforms and commissions. Now, I would suggest you know this. Von Rad points to a range of texts. We might think most famously of the intro to John's account of the gospel in John 1. Before we get to the telling of the Word becoming flesh and tabernacling amongst us such that we see God's glory, we learn first that this Word was in the beginning with God. And we have this remarkable retelling of the Genesis creation account, so that we know that the Word who has come so near, the Word who has taken on our fleshly form, that Word is also the maker and creator. But we see this long before John and the other evangelists are telling us about Jesus who has shown up and come so near. We can look back to the very pages of Genesis itself. Von Rad will highlight the fact that the creation account of Genesis is very much prologue. Genesis 1-11 telling this cosmic primeval story of the beginnings of God's work with the whole world as a lead-in and introduction so that we can appreciate what God is doing in and through Abraham and his people. And in a more profound way, we could pan out more broadly The entire book of Genesis is also a remarkable introduction if you think about it. Moses, the writer, is not around for the events of Genesis. He's giving deep background. It's that moment at the beginning of the episode where it's recapping what's occurred in previous episodes. It's introducing characters. It's helping you understand who they are and what they can do. Moses tells his story beginning in Exodus and continuing on through Deuteronomy. Genesis, the creation account especially, is there to help us interpret, to help us appreciate, that we might savor its distinctive character, that we might appreciate his particular traits and capacities, his loves, his attributes. And it's not just Genesis. It's not just John. We see this across the scriptures. The Psalms will regularly tie these two things together. One example from Psalm 119, verse 73, saying, "Your hands have made and fashioned me. Give me understanding that I may learn your commandments." The psalmist there goes asking God to give understanding of God's own commandments, not only and not even primarily because they're God's commandments, and he would be uniquely capable to know what they're about, but first and foremost here, because God is the one who made him. God knows who he is. God knows how he's meant to function. What is the very grain and fiber of his being? What would flourishing and fullness look like? God is uniquely capable to instruct, to expound, to illumine, because the psalmist knows God to be not only his teacher and redeemer, but first his maker and creator. We see this idea unfolded also in the New Testament. So Paul, writing to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 4, will say this in verses 5 and 6. "For what we proclaim is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, with ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ." You see, Paul is likening God's illumination of our hearts as Christian women and men, as those who can perceive God's glory in the face of Jesus, his Messiah. That giving of light, that shedding of illumination in our hearts is likened to God's act of calling light out of darkness in the very beginning. God's goodness, God's generosity, God's enlightenment and illumination, God's outpouring graciousness and goodness are on display there, making God uniquely fit to shed his light abroad in our hearts. Because he is our creator who brought light into this dark space, he is uniquely fit to be our redeemer, to shed light, glorious light, into the sinful crevices of our corrupt hearts. Paul will go further, though. In Romans 4, speaking of the story of Abraham, Paul will tie not only creation, but Christ's resurrection and the justification of the ungodly together. Notice the way he pulls together that three-stranded cord here as involving the very character of God and his power and goodness. In verses 16 and 17, he says this, "That's why it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all his offspring, not only to the adherents of the law, but also to the one who shares the faith of Abraham, who's the father of us all. As it's written, 'I've made you, Abraham, the father of many nations, in the presence of the God in whom he believed, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist.'" Paul there is saying, justifying the ungodly by faith alone requires the same power and might, the same generosity and goodness as was required to bring Jesus out of the grave. And Paul is saying the same power and might and generosity and goodness that are involved in bringing Jesus out of the grave are what was shown and manifest in creating all things from no thing. He suggests that the one who creates ex nihilo, who makes all by his will and goodness, by his very word, he is uniquely situated to have the power to call dead things to life and to summon Jesus out of that tomb. And he alone bears the power and the goodness that he might likewise call you or me in our corruption and sinful death to new life, justifying us not when we were his friends, not when we were those who had done him good, but when we were the ungodly, when we were the enemy, when we were dead in our trespasses and sin. Paul will go still further. In Colossians 1, one final example. In that famous hymn, we find him connecting the praise of Jesus as a praise given to one who was in the beginning and now is in the new beginning, our gracious Redeemer and Provider. He says this in Colossians 1, 15-20, "The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He's before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He's the beginning and the firstborn from the dead, so that in him everything he might have the supremacy." Notice here, Paul says he is firstborn over all creation, and now he is firstborn from among the dead. We see that the work of Jesus, the Christ, the Son of God, is a work that is marked by his priority, not only in calling us from death to life, but in having been the one to give us life from the very beginning, to have been the one involved in that first work, and now on display in his steadfast love, his covenant faithfulness in this second, more glorious work. Well, looking at those passages and keeping in mind the way the Bible seems repeatedly to say these two things together, I want to reflect, to meditate with you for just a few minutes on the significance of that. Why is it these things keep appearing next to each other? What's the bearing? What's the significance? And how does this speak to the unique fitness of this one for that office? How is it that this in some way plays a key role in who he is, in what he does, and in the consequence that has for your life and for the life of the world? To do that, I want to turn back. I'm not going to steal other people's thunder and introduce Anselm any further. I want to go further back, if we might, to the 4th century, to someone who reflected on this issue at great depth, though he's often been overlooked at just this point. It's ironic. Some of you perhaps may know this year, 2025, is a year where many Christians around the globe are marking an anniversary. It's the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea, gathered in Nicaea in 325, from which came the first edition, you might say, of perhaps the most significant creed or confessional statement that has been turned to by Christians through the ages and around the globe. And that is no small thing. You can check out the blogs. We can disagree on a whole range of things. When we find ourselves across various languages and cultures and traditions and histories, it is no small thing to see concrete evidence of that which binds us together. That's why Paul speaks so pointedly to that in Ephesians 4, I think. The idea of commending the fact that we have one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of us all. And so it's good that we reflect even those who maybe haven't ever really thought about the Nicene Creed in any depth, that this would be an occasion to consider it. And Athanasius of Alexandria will probably be the most talked about character related to that creed and the issues going on in that decade, involved in debates with the arch-heretic Arius of Alexandria, so crucial for shaping our understanding of the incarnation of the Word of God, our understanding of who Christ is, what he does. I'd invite many of you to take up C.S. Lewis's suggestion. He wrote the great preface to Athanasius' work on the Incarnation. And that's where he famously argued that we ought to turn to read old books that might challenge us, that might take us out of our own setting. And we don't have access to the future books yet, so the past ones really are the ones that we can go to for that effect. And he believed Athanasius' text, his voice, was a profound one. I want to draw your attention just briefly to something that rarely gets talked about, though, as people give ear to Athanasius. That great work on the Incarnation, written in the late 320s, it's actually a sequel. It's the second of two works, and the earlier one is a work against the Gentiles. Don't take it personally if, like me, you're a Gentile. It's not dissing you. It's challenging certain ideas, certain philosophical notions, certain ways or habits of living that were dominant in the wider culture, and I would suspect are still prominent in our own. And it's interesting because he doesn't just write that first book and leave it be, and then address on the Incarnation, but in that great work on the Incarnation, the first 10 or so pages are a summary, a recap of that first work against the Gentiles. And here's the thing, Athanasius, he didn't have an editor. It's rather apparent. It's titled on the Incarnation. It's written to address matters Christological. And you read it, and the first 10 pages are all about understanding God's creation of all things. And I take good cheer from this, occasionally knowing that students and perhaps teenage children might think that I'm given to a tangent or two at times. And I can know, well, there, Athanasius had a 10-page tangent at the very beginning of his most famous book, right? There's hope for us all. But it's not a tangent. And there's something profound in the way he begins that book. He's trying to instruct us that if you get the cosmos wrong, you're going to look at the Christ strangely. If you miss the nature of God's great work in creation, you're likely to misperceive the mysterious and beautiful character of God's rescue of that creation. Christ isn't just a spontaneous occurrence, but he's an intervention in a long history. And Christ isn't just a new character on the scene, but he's the incarnation of the eternal Son of God, who has been active and engaged, who has planned and performed many mighty works. And so we might be led to believe that his character, his attributes, his persona is not merely on display in the Incarnation, but has also been manifest here and there in all the mighty acts, in all the wondrous works of God. Well, Athanasius begins here by saying there are three basic things, preliminary things about creation we need to register before we think about the redeeming work of Jesus. He says first, the Bible is very clear. God's creation isn't just spontaneous happenstance. It's got a purposeful intent. God said, let this be and let that be. And God declared it good and very good. What we see here is divine design and purposeful intention. And that's crucial because we're going to get to the story of Jesus, and we need to be reminded that God doesn't act in an arbitrary fashion. And this history doesn't come in mere happenstance. Here too, we have one who reveals that he's come to do the will of his Father. He's come to seek and save the lost. There's a divine necessity. There's a purpose and an intent that can be found in eternity past, from which this whole story is generated and set in motion. Athanasius says, secondly, we also need to remember creation isn't about ordering pre-existent matter. This isn't moving the furniture merely, as some might think. This is about total newness, God creating all things ex nihilo, from nothing. The source of all is not some stuff, it is merely God's goodwill and his goodness. It is his voice, it is his gracious generosity and his creative agency. And we need to remember that too when we come to his later act. That Jesus isn't merely the eventual arrival of a generation that finally would claw its way to the top. He's not the latest, greatest religious figure. I knew eventually we would iterate enough. We'd adapt far enough. We would update just enough times. We would tweak. We would learn, we would progress, and eventually one of us would get there. Many people were then and are still tempted to interpret Jesus as one stage in the evolution of religious experience. But Athanasius wants us to catch this is divine interruption. This is God coming down, as the creed leads us to say. From heaven, he came down and was made man for us and for our salvation. He intervenes apocalyptically. He's not merely the latest, greatest, or the next and best. He is God. He is the staggering interruption and invasion of grace in person. And we need to be reminded of that. The virgin birth at its beginning and the resurrection at its end are like bookends, T.F. Torrance would say, reminding us to read the whole gospel account as being a story not merely of religious evolution and human progress, but of the need for God himself to stoop and to condescend and to enter into our midst, so to save us. So it was with creation in the beginning, from nothing. So it is with his work of redemption in Christ in these last days. Third, and finally, Athanasius says, we also need to remember creation isn't a battle where good and evil forces duke it out and good happens to defeat the evil principles. No, creation is radically different from those other myths. As the Bible tells it, creation is a story of sovereign purpose and overwhelming action. What we see here is simple and straightforward. Divine declaration leads to cosmological appearance and existence. And what we see here too is that Jesus, though he is opposed, is not having to defeat opponents. He has no peer. He is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. What we see as we read the gospel accounts and we encounter the finale in those passion narratives is that he alone lays down his life. No one takes it. This is not the story of good having to arm wrestle evil and squeaking out the win. It's the remarkable triumph. It's the overwhelming victory. It's the parodic defeat of the purported opponents, who are in fact no opponents. We need to remember these basic things: purpose, sovereignty, a God who is transcendent beyond all opposition, as we turn from creation to the great work of redemption. Now, Athanasius says this leads to great payoff as we think about the many things Christ is for you and for me, the many ways he blesses us. And isn't that one of the great things of the gospel? The gospel offers so much. The gospel is Christ-centered. Our every hope is found in him. It's not Jesus and a political program or a way of parenting. It's not Jesus and some sort of economic protocol to the happy life. Everything is given to us graciously in and through Jesus. All the promises of God are yes in Christ. But that that behooves us to ask, what are all the many promises God has offered? If we're going to be Christ-centered and if we're going to insist that all the goodness we'll ever have and all the needs we'll ever long to be satisfied, they're going to be met in Jesus and Jesus alone. If we're going to proclaim solus Christus and be Christ-centered in that way, we need to have eyes wide open and attention wide enough to all the many promises of God. And Athanasius, in a brief book, says you can see the wide range of needs. He highlights two here in this text that I'd want to leave you with. I think they're relevant. I think you might identify with them even. I certainly do. He speaks of how first there's what he calls the dilemma of death and corruption. Having been made to share life with God, we've turned to sin in pursuit of a life on our own, and we've found instead anything but life. We've brought upon ourselves death, and we've experienced the decay of corrupting self-fascination in this own life. Augustine, of course, by the end of the century, will be speaking of that image of the human in sin being curved in on him or herself. Self-fascination leading us to shrivel up, as it were. This is the dilemma of death and corruption, that we're parasitically being eaten away by our stubborn insistence on being our own God, going our own way. Athanasius says, secondly, there's a different dilemma, what he calls the dilemma of ignorance. Having been made to image and display who God is, we ironically have turned so far as to be ourselves now ignorant of God. Tragic irony, brutal poetic justice on display, that though we were first called in Genesis 1 to be mirrors who would display God to others, we now, as Romans 1 puts it, we have suppressed the knowledge of God evident in creation and in conscience, much less on display in God's mighty works. And we ourselves are now ignorant. We ourselves have suppressed such that we do not have that true knowledge of God any longer. And here's the response. Athanasius says, it will appear not at all contradictory in both these ways that the Father works in salvation in the same one by whom he created. With regard to our life in the face of death and corruption, with regard to our knowledge in the face of ignorance and foolishness. How? Well, first, Christ is the fitting conclusion to what's come before. Christ the Creator is fit. He's especially fit, we might say, to be the Redeemer, to address that death and our corruption. Here, Athanasius looks especially to the objections of the non-believing Jews of his day. He argues against them, Jesus is the fulfillment of those promises of life and of blessing. Jesus is the long-awaited Messiah. Jesus is the one who wants to bring restoration and is capable, uniquely capable, to bring true and final renewal. Not the partial and occasional experience of bits of reprieve that have been found in past decades and recent centuries at the hands of political authorities and the occasional revolutionary and the latest and greatest rabbi, but the one who alone can be the Prince of Peace and who can come instituting an everlasting kingdom with no end. And here we see, according to Athanasius, that having given life, Jesus, the Creator, can alone effortlessly give life anew without fear of defeat by death or competition from any corrupting influence. But that's not all. Secondly, Christ is also the fitting solution to what's gone awry. Christ, the mighty maker, is fit, especially fit, we might say, to be the revealer, to address foolishness and ignorance. And here, Athanasius has in mind the Gentiles, people like me, I suppose. He thinks of them in the way in which they view the story of Christ. And Athanasius, in a sense, insists that Christ actually reveals the true God more fully, more effectively, more authentically, more honestly than all the myriad of vestiges of divine grace scattered elsewhere in the world. He's a fitting remedy to the way God's glory was evident in innocence, and it is now turned callously and corruptly to foolish ruin. Having first instructed our human parents in innocence, he alone has primal pure knowledge to offer. And so Athanasius does point out that John speaks of the one who was in the beginning with God and was God, the one by whom all things were created, as being the one who's identified as light coming into the world, before he's identified as Word become flesh, whose glory we can perceive. He turns to Paul in those words of promise and joy in talking about God who called light out of darkness, now having in the same manner, with the same power and purpose, shining his light into the darkness of our hearts, that we might see the glory of God revealed in the face of Jesus Christ. Gurus you shall have, politicians you will ever turn to, leaders of thought, leaders of culture we will ever find appealing, but this is something different. Here we have one who alone is especially fit, not to be marred by the corruption and ignorance of those who've callously turned from God, but instead to know God from the inside out, to have known that pure and complete intimacy of oneness with God, because he is God. He is the very word and expression of God's own knowledge. He is the outward-facing mission of God's beneficence and goodness. He is uniquely fit to turn the ignorant into the wise, to call us from foolishness to the wisdom and the power of the cross of which we've sang. So then, where does Athanasius lead us? How does this land as we think about the power of the atoning work of Christ? It's crucial, of course, to know that he is divine. It's essential to realize that he becomes truly and authentically human. I think it's also key, however, that the Bible repeatedly connects redemption to his creative work. Here we can see so many of his attributes brought to the foreground. I mentioned but a few in closing. Here, the firstborn of creation is shown also to be the firstborn from the dead. Here, the first Alpha is himself also declared to be the final Omega. And so we see the same power and might displayed in creating from nothing, in raising Jesus from the dead, and yes, in justifying the ungodly, the dead, the enemies of God, people like you and me. Here we also see the same wisdom and knowledge from on high displayed in making all the myriad intricacies of the wide universe, and also calling into being your every cell, all the particularities of each and every person and occupant of this world. And that same wisdom is intent now on mending their every corruption and making them and you and me too all glorious and whole. This same God, steadfast, faithful, true to his word, he fashions us now, and he's uniquely and therefore only fit to redeem us. We see this again and again in so many respects. The way in which God's word goes out, the way in which God's name is attached to his people, the way in which God is committed to demonstrating his steadfastness. So much so that you may recall Moses in Exodus 32 and 33 can remind God that God's name is upon his people, and having shown such favor, having called them into covenant, having delivered them from Egypt, surely he wouldn't abandon them now. And so God steadfastly not only presses on, but eventually leads them into the land in the next generation. And we see, of course, in the book of Numbers, again, when the grumbling is hit, and again, one might think God's had enough, reminded of the way that he's placed his name on them. He's shown his generosity to them. He's demonstrated his might in sustaining them through so many trials and struggles. He's led again to sustain, to carry, to guide, to provide a hope. And it's not surprising then that the psalmist, so honest about himself, so observant about God, might take heart, believing that he could find clarity and light for the way ahead, something that matters both to a shepherd and a king, and I suspect to every Christian or follower of God. And he took heart knowing that there might be direction and clarity ahead because he can pray to the one who made him, and he can pray to the one who has given the previous revelation. And he needs understanding to understand that revelation, and he needs knowledge so that he might make wise choices and follow in God's way. And he doesn't lean upon his aptitude or his training. He doesn't lean upon what I assume were many hours and even years spent in contemplation in the wilderness. He simply turns to pray that God would give understanding because God was the one who made him and fashioned him. We see again and again the most profound comfort and assurance that the promise and pledge of gospel light is found in knowing that the one who offers that word, who gives us that assurance, is one who has displayed such might, such lordship, such goodness, and such generosity. Not only in sending Jesus in those last days, but in having given us all the many days of our lives, in having by his word created all things from nothing, with purpose, with power, above any peer or opposition. As we think about the redeeming atonement of Jesus then, we want to remember that he is God. We want to appreciate that he becomes truly human. We also want to know that grace, in fact, does not forget, much less destroy nature, but it perfects and fulfills it. And that says something profound, not only about you or me as those who are the objects of that gracious mercy. First, that says something about God. God, who is the great maker in nature, in creation. God who now in his steadfastness and faithfulness, God still in his might and power, God ever again in his goodness and grace continues to work wonders. Now in these last days, as we've heard concerning his son. Thanks so much for your time and attention.